So, I want you to just imagine for a second that you're standing right on the banks of the Hooghly River.
Okay.
You're in Calcutta, and the year is, let's say, somewhere right around 1820.
A very specific time to drop into.
Right, and the air is just thick, humid, maybe a little smoky from the city. But out there on the water, you see these massive, imposing British ships.
Oh, yeah. The East India Company vessels.
Exactly. And they are just driven by this aggressive, cutting-edge navigation science of the West. They're docking with this incredible sense of purpose.
It's basically the physical manifestation of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
Just pulling right up to the doorstep of India.
It is. It represents this relentless forward momentum. But then I want you to turn around.
Turn away from the river.
Yeah, turn your back to the water and look at the city behind you. Look at the society that's actually inhabiting it.
It's a stark contrast.
It's more than stark. It feels entirely frozen. Like it's ancient and obviously rich in history, but it's stuck. It's caught in this really suffocating web of rigid caste hierarchies and superstition.
Rituals that haven't changed in centuries.
Exactly. It is a literal collision of two completely different time zones.
And that contrast, that really jarring disconnect between this dynamic scientific West and the stagnant traditional East, that is really the heartbeat of our whole discussion today.
Because it wasn't just a military thing, right?
No, not at all. It wasn't just a military occupation or even just a transfer of tax revenue. It was a psychological earthquake.
A psychological earthquake. I actually love that phrasing because it really shook the foundations of how Indians saw themselves.
It had to.
And it triggered this massive internal churning that historians usually call the Indian Renaissance, which is exactly what we are unpacking today. We are taking a deep dive into Spectrum's book of modern history.
Specifically Unit 4, Chapter 8.
Right, the chapter on socio-religious reform movements.
And I'd argue this is one of those chapters that essentially defines the modern Indian identity for anyone studying it today.
Oh, absolutely. And we aren't just going to sit here and recite dates and names like some kind of laundry list. We really want to unpack the mindset of this entire era.
We need to figure out why this awakening happened exactly when it did.
And who the architects were.
Yes, and most importantly, what intellectual tools they used. The actual ideas they weaponized to dismantle centuries of tradition from the inside out.
It's such a fascinating story of identity and struggle. But before we get completely lost in the dusty lanes of 19th century Bengal, we do have a really important message for the learner who is listening to us right now.
We do.
This deep dive is proudly brought to you by Simplified UPSC by PPP.
That's right. And if you are finding value in this deep dive, if this conversation is, helping you connect the dots for your own preparation or just building your general knowledge base,
we humbly ask you to subscribe to the YouTube channel. It really, really helps with our retention metrics, and it just ensures we can keep making this super high-quality content for you.
It makes a huge difference. And for those of you who are capable and want to support the mission even further, please consider supporting us on Patreon.
Yes, Patreon is what keeps this super useful content coming your way. So a massive, massive shout out to all our current supporters.
You guys are literally the backbone of this operation.
You couldn't do it without you. And hey, don't forget to like this video and share your valuable comments down below. We really want to hear from you.
Let us know what you're taking away from this or how it connects to the specific topics you're studying.
And I have a major pro tip for the serious students out there, especially if you are eyeing that UPSC syllabus. Free notes, complete with practice, previous year questions, or PYQs are available right now on our public Telegram channel.
You really do not want to miss out on those free resources.
But if you want the absolute full premium experience, and I am talking access to all the videos in this series at once, beautifully organized premium notes, extra PYQs, and even model mains answers,
then you need to join the private Telegram library.
Exactly. It is a total game changer for structured learning. Just shoot us a DM on the public Telegram channel to join that private library.
Highly recommend doing that today.
Okay, so business aside, let's get back to that massive collision happening in Calcutta. The why is always the most important question we can ask in history.
Always.
India had been invaded so many times before. We had the Aryans, the Greeks, the Turks, the Mughals. Why was the British conquest the specific trigger for such a radical social change?
It's the fundamental question you have to start with.
Right. Like, why didn't the Mughals trigger a renaissance in this specific way?
Well, the source text makes a really critical distinction right out of the gate here. If you look at all those previous invaders, generally speaking, they settled within India's frontiers.
They made it their home.
Exactly, they put down roots. And culturally, they were either completely absorbed by the indigenous culture, or they interacted with it to create a fusion.
Like the whole Indo-Islamic culture we saw flourish during the medieval period.
Right. They became part of the land's actual fabric. A Mughal emperor was, for all intents and purposes, an Indian emperor.
But the British were different.
The British were fundamentally different. They didn't settle here to become Indian. They remained distinct. They remained aggressively foreign.
They were always looking back to London.
Always. And more importantly, they represented a culture, Western culture, that in the 18th and 19th centuries was just riding the absolute high of the Enlightenment.
You were feeling very confident.
Incredibly confident. It was a scientific, industrial worldview. They didn't just bring swords and guns. They brought an entire philosophy that claimed absolute superiority based on reason.
So for the very first time, Indians weren't just facing a military defeat on a battlefield?
No, they were facing a cultural judgment.
A cultural judgment. That is heavy.
It was an existential crisis for the enlightened Indians of the time. Imagine being told that the reason you lost isn't just because the other guy had better cannons, but because your entire society is rotten.
That hits incredibly hard.
It did hit hard. And it led directly to this massive aha moment. These intellectuals realized that their subjugation was rooted in the fact that Indian society itself had become stagnant.
The text actually uses the word decadent, right?
Yes, stagnant and decadent. There was this harsh realization that while Europe was constantly moving forward with science and reason, India was just stuck in a loop.
A loop of tradition that had lost all its vitality. Decadent is such a strong word to use.
It implies decay, rotting from the inside out.
But when you actually look at the social conditions described in the text, what they call the vicious web, it's kind of hard to argue against that word.
What did this web actually look like on the ground?
Well, it was a web that trapped the individual completely. You had religion, which, should theoretically be a source of spiritual strength or ethical guidance.
Right, ideally.
But it had become entirely steeped in magic and superstition. The text explicitly mentions things like idolatry, polytheism, and this incredibly suffocating reliance on the priestly class.
That monopoly of the priests seems to be a recurring theme in almost every reform movement in history, not just in India.
It is so central to the problem. Think about it. The common person did not have direct access to their own scriptures.
Because the texts were in Sanskrit.
Or Arabic. Languages the masses simply didn't speak or read.
So they had to rely entirely on the interpretation of the priests.
Exactly. And that interpretation often meant that religious observance became less about morality and much more about fear.
Fear of what, exactly?
Fear of the unknown, fear of bad luck, fear of these angry deities. So religion just turned into a transaction.
You perform this complex ritual, you pay this specific fee to the priest, and you avoid bad luck.
Right. It was all about outward conformity, not inner conscience.
So you have this massive internal rot of superstition on one hand, and then externally you have the British actively judging you, calling your entire society backward.
It's a total pressure cooker environment.
So how did people actually react to that pressure? Because the text makes it clear it wasn't a uniform reaction at all.
No, definitely not. It wasn't like everyone just woke up and agreed to change everything.
The text describes this fascinating spectrum of reactions to the West. And it's really interesting to look at the extremes first.
Like the radical westernizers.
Yes, the Young Bengal movement is the perfect example here.
Those were the radical Bengali youth associated with Henry Vivian Derosio, right?
That's them. They were so utterly disgusted by the superstition and the rot they saw in their own society that they swung hard to the complete opposite extreme.
They basically developed a revulsion for the Hindu religion.
They did.
Yeah.
I mean, there are anecdotes about them deliberately eating beef and drinking wine publicly just to shock Orthodox society.
Just rebellion for the sheer sake of rebellion.
Exactly. They wanted to tear the whole house down. They thought the only way to be truly modern was to essentially become British in thought and habit.
But that wasn't the mainstream response, was it?
No, and that's key. That kind of extreme radicalism just alienated everyday people. It didn't drive the broader Renaissance.
So what was the mainstream response? The one that actually gained traction and stuck?
The mainstream response, the one led by absolute giants like Raja Rammohan Roy, was much more nuanced than that.
It wasn't about just becoming British?
No, it wasn't blind imitation at all. But crucially, it also wasn't a stubborn, blind rejection of the West either.
It was a middle path.
It was a synthetic path. The core idea was to invigorate traditional institutions. The thought process went something like this. The British are powerful because of their science and reason.
Okay.
But our ancient texts also have profound wisdom. So let's use Western reason to clean up our own house.
I see.
Let's scrub away all this accumulated superstition so we can actually face this colonial challenge on our own terms.
I really like that framing. It's not saying I want to be you. It's saying I want to be a better version of myself, but I'll use the tools I just learned from you.
Precisely. They wanted to prove that Indian culture at its absolute core was not inferior. It was just covered in centuries of dust.
To do that, though, they needed more than just good intentions. They needed a real strategy.
They needed an intellectual toolkit.
Yes, the text actually refers to an intellectual toolkit. I love that phrase because it implies they were actively building something new. Let's break this down for the listener.
Sure.
Who were the actual people wielding these tools?
Well, we have to look at the demographics first. The main protagonists here are the newly emerging middle class.
But this is a crucial distinction for the listener, especially if you're comparing this to European history. This wasn't a middle class of industrialists.
Right, because usually when we say middle class in the context of the 19th century, we immediately think of factory owners, the bourgeoisie, the people making all the money from the Industrial Revolution.
But in India, who controlled all the industry?
The British did.
Of course.
So this Indian middle class was a very different breed. They were government servants, lawyers, doctors, journalists, teachers.
The intelligentsia?
Exactly. They were Western-educated professionals.
So their capital wasn't money. Their capital was ideas.
That's a great way to put it. And because they were educated in Western institutions, which were often established by the British, they had absorbed all these Enlightenment values.
Democracy, reason, humanism, the rights of man.
And they took those foreign values and tried to skillfully graft them onto the Indian context.
The text lists 3 major pillars of their ideology. If you are taking notes out there, this is exactly where you want to write them down.
Rationalism, religious universalism, and humanism.
Let's start with rationalism, because that really is the bedrock of everything else.
It is. In today's world, we kind of take rationalism for granted. We check facts, we look for evidence. But in the 19th century, in a society entirely ruled by dogma, this was revolutionary.
Explosive, really.
Rationalism is just the basic idea that you shouldn't accept something just because a priest said so, or even just because it's written in a book that claims to be holy.
You only accept it if it makes sense, if it actually stands up to the test of reason.
Right. And Raja Rammohan Roy is the absolute titan here.
How did he apply this in practice?
He was relentless with it. He firmly believed in the principle of causality, that everything has a logical cause and effect. He wanted religion to be demonstrable.
Demonstrable, like you have to prove it.
Yes. He argued that God gave humans this incredible faculty of reason, so why on earth would God want us to just suspend it when we worship?
That makes a lot of sense.
If a religious practice caused actual harm, or if it was deeply illogical, it simply couldn't be godly, no matter what the local tradition said.
There is a quote in the text from Akshay Kumar Dutt that I just absolutely love. He said, "Rationalism is our only preceptor."
That is such a bold statement for the time.
Because preceptor means teacher or guide.
Yes, he's literally saying human reason is our only guru. Dutt was actually even more radical in some ways than Roy.
How so?
He went so far as to say that natural and social phenomena should be analyzed exactly like mechanics, like a physical machine. You look at the parts, you see how they work together. You don't just wave your hands and say it's magic.
But here is the real genius of their approach. And I think this is a huge takeaway for anyone trying to understand how change actually happens in deeply conservative societies.
What's that?
These reformers didn't necessarily throw away the scriptures. They actually used the scriptures to validate reason.
Explain that dynamic a bit more, because on the surface, it sounds contradictory. If you believe so strongly in reason, why do you even need to reference the scripture?
Think of it like a legal strategy. If you are arguing with a deeply orthodox person, right, a pundit who has spent his entire life memorizing the Shastras, you can't just walk up to him and say, hey, Western science says this practice is bad.
Right, they wouldn't care at all.
Yeah.
Science isn't an authority to them.
Exactly. They'll just say, well, the Shastra says it's good, so your science is obviously wrong.
So how do you beat that?
You say, look, I've read the Shastra too. And look at this specific ancient verse. The Vedas also don't support this modern practice.
Oh, wow. So you corner them.
You corner them completely. You are using their own absolute authority to dismantle their argument from the inside.
That is a brilliant tactical move.
Yeah.
They were using the unquestioned authority of the past to legitimize the modernization of the present.
It's so smart. But the ultimate test always remained reason. If a scripture blatantly defied reason, the reformers were finally willing to say, then the scripture is wrong, or at least our current interpretation of it is totally flawed.
It was this massive, seismic shift of authority away from the written text and directly to the human mind.
Which flows seamlessly right into the second pillar, religious universalism.
This one feels like a direct response to the whole "my God is better than your God" conflict.
Definitely.
But it was also a direct response to the Christian missionaries arriving with the British, who were loudly claiming their religion was the only true path to salvation.
It was a very conscious attempt to find the common denominator among all people. And Raja Rammohan Roy was a master of this as well.
He really was. He defended the monotheism of the Vedas, arguing that Hinduism is fundamentally about one single God.
But at the very same time, he also defended the Unitarianism of Christianity.
He was constantly looking for that core universal truth beneath the rituals.
Yes, the central idea that there is one God, and all these different religions, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, are really just different national embodiments of that exact same truth.
Like different languages describing the exact same object.
The text mentions Syed Ahmed Khan holding a very similar view for Islam.
Yes, he argued that all prophets essentially had the same din, or faith,
Yeah.
even if they belonged to completely different nations and lived in different times.
It's a deeply unifying thought process. It naturally reduces the friction between communities if you truly believe everyone is ultimately walking on the same path.
It takes all the toxic us versus them energy right out of religion.
And that leads us to the third pillar, which I honestly think is the most impactful one in terms of the daily life for the average person back then.
Yeah.
Humanism. It sounds like this lofty philosophical term, but in this specific context, it just shifted the focus from salvation in the afterlife to actual progress in this life.
That is the key shift. For centuries, the entire focus of religious life was essentially, what do I need to do right now so that I have a good life after I die?
Or, how do I escape the cycle of rebirth entirely?
Right. But the reformers stepped in and said, wait a minute, what about the immense suffering happening right here on Earth?
What about the widow being burned alive? What about the child being married off at 8 years old?
Exactly. So instead of just worrying about heaven and hell, maybe start worrying about whether your neighbor has food and basic dignity.
The new morality wasn't about performing the technically correct ritual to please a silent deity.
It was about social utility. That's the exact phrase the text uses, social utility.
I love that phrase.
Is this specific practice good for human beings? Does it help society function better? And if the answer is no, then it's simply not good religion.
That concept of social utility is the ultimate test. It's almost strictly utilitarian.
It totally empowered the individual. It told everyday people, you don't need a priest to tell you what is right or wrong. You have a conscience. You have reason.
If you see someone suffering, that is bad. You don't need an ancient text to confirm that suffering is bad.
It was a very direct, fatal attack on the priestly domination we talked about earlier.
Okay, so we have the people driving the newly educated middle class, and we have their tools: rationalism, universalism, humanism.
The toolkit.
Right. But as they started to organize and gain momentum, they didn't all take the exact same path forward.
No, the text clearly distinguishes between two main streams of these movements, reformist and revivalist.
Now, I have to be completely honest here. The term revivalist often gets a really bad rap today.
It does.
It sounds, well, conservative, like a Make India Great Again campaign, but in a very backward-looking, regressive way.
That is a very common misconception. And for the UPSC aspirant listening right now, this is a crucial distinction to get right, especially in your mains answers. You cannot paint all these groups with the same brush.
Let's break it down properly then.
First, you have the reformist movements.
Yeah.
These are groups like the Brahmo Samaj, the Prathana Samaj, the Aligarh movement.
Yeah.
Their basic approach was, the West has some genuinely great ideas. Let's adapt them for ourselves. They relied very heavily on reason and Western modernism. They were openly, proudly looking forward.
That makes perfect sense. So what about the revivalists?
The revivalists, like the Arya Samaj or the Deoband movement, their main slogan was essentially, go back to the source.
For the Arya Samaj, the slogan was literally back to the Vedas, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which definitely sounds like they just want to retreat into the ancient past.
It does sound like that.
But here's the massive twist.
Yeah.
They deeply believed that the ancient religion, the original Vedic religion, was already pure, highly scientific, and perfect.
Okay.
They believed that all the current social problems, the rigid caste system, the superstition, the gross gender inequality, were all corruptions.
Corruptions that crept in later on.
Yes, during the later Puranic or medieval ages. So they weren't actually saying, let's keep doing what we are doing today.
They were saying, what we are doing right now is completely wrong because it's a corruption of our own original perfect truth.
Exactly. And this incredibly clever framing allowed them to be incredibly radical in practice.
Give me an example.
The Arya Samaj, despite being labeled revivalist, fiercely opposed child marriage. They loudly supported women's education. They actively attacked the hereditary caste system.
Wow. Why?
Because they successfully argued that none of those oppressive things existed in the original Vedas.
That is fascinating. So one group says modernize because it's the rational thing to do, and the other group says modernize because it's actually our original authentic tradition.
Different paths, but a very similar destination, at least initially. And we have to remember, it wasn't just about religion in a vacuum. The text calls this whole movement a cultural agenda.
It was an attempt to reconstruct the entire way of life.
Yes. What languages you speak, promoting vernaculars like Bengali, Marathi, Urdu, instead of just elitist Sanskrit or Persian.
It was about modern education.
It was about how you dress, what kind of food you eat, what medicine you take. They were trying to build a completely modern Indian identity that could stand tall and look the British in the eye.
And nowhere, absolutely nowhere, was this desperate need for reconstruction more visceral than in the lives of women.
Section 4 of our outline deals heavily with this.
And I have to say, the picture painted by the source text regarding the status of women is, frankly, it's horrifying.
It is utterly heartbreaking to read. The text describes the 19th century status quo for women as being an inferior adjunct.
Inferior adjunct.
That phrase means she literally had no legal or social identity of her own. She was merely an attachment to a man, a father, a husband, or a son.
And the list of normalized abuses is just overwhelming. Female infanticide, child marriage, rampant polygamy.
It was a literal minefield from the moment of birth to the moment of death, if she was even allowed to be born at all.
Exactly. Can we touch on Humanism in Bengal for a second? Because the text mentions it specifically as a major issue.
Humanism is a very stark, very dark example of how twisted the social system had become. It was primarily a high caste phenomenon.
Okay.
It allowed Kulan Brahmins to marry as many women as they possibly wanted. And because it was considered this massive social honor for a family to marry their daughter to a Kulan.
You had these men, sometimes really old men, literally on their deathbeds, marrying teenage girls or even little children.
Yes. And it wasn't for companionship or love. Often it was purely for the dowry money.
Or just for the social prestige it gave the girl's father.
But think about the brutal math of that situation. An old man marries a young girl. He inevitably dies shortly after. What happens to the girl?
She becomes a widow at age 10, 12, maybe 15.
And in that specific society, a high caste widow was considered socially dead. She absolutely could not remarry.
She was condemned to a life of extreme punishing austerity. Shaved head, a plain white sari, maybe one simple meal a day, total isolation from society.
She was basically treated as a walking inauspicious omen.
Or, if she was really unlucky, she faced Sati.
Sati. The ritual burning of widows alive on their deceased husbands' funeral pyres.
It is the most visceral, shocking symbol of this entire era.
It is genuinely hard for us to even comprehend today the mass psychology that allowed an entire community to stand around, watch a woman burn alive, and call it an act of piety.
Raja Rammohan Roy famously described it as murder according to every Shastra. That phrase always sticks right with me.
Oh, powerful.
He didn't just call it cruel or sad. He called it strictly illegal by their own religious standards.
He was a brilliant tactician in his attack on Sati. He knew that if he just argued from a place of Western emotion, saying, oh, this is so sad and barbaric, the Orthodox leaders would just dismiss him entirely.
They would just say suffering is the required path to salvation.
Exactly. So he challenged them directly on their own home turf. He studied the ancient texts deeper and better than they did.
And he asked them for proof.
He said, show me. Show me exactly where Manu or Yajnavalkya explicitly commands you to burn the widow.
And when they obviously couldn't find the mandatory command in the texts.
He seized the moral and legal high ground. He successfully proved to the public and the British that Sati wasn't a core religious requirement at all.
It was just a brutal custom driven by familial greed, relatives wanting the husband's property, and deep-seated misogyny.
His relentless efforts were the primary driving force behind the 1829 regulation under Governor General William Bentinck, which finally officially banned the practice.
But saving a woman's life from the fire was really just step one, because if she survived as a widow, her life was still largely miserable, as we just discussed.
Right, she was still socially dead.
Which brings us to the next great battle of the era, widow remarriage. And the absolute hero of this specific fight is Pandit Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar.
Vidyasagar. His name literally translates to ocean of knowledge, and he is a massive hero of this narrative.
The stigma against widows remarrying was just immense. It was considered a massive sin, basically equivalent to blatant adultery.
And Vidyasagar, being this highly respected Sanskrit scholar and actually a principal of a prestigious Sanskrit college, did exactly what Roy did. He heavily scoured the ancient texts.
He was looking for a loophole, basically.
Not even a loophole, really, a clear precedent. And he actually found it in the Parasharas Samhita.
What did it say?
He found a verse that essentially stated, if a husband is dead or missing or impotent, a woman can legitimately take another husband.
I mean, dropping that verse into that society must have been an absolute bombshell.
It was explosive. He printed thousands of pamphlets highlighting this specific verse. He slammed it right on the tables of the most orthodox pundits in Bengal.
He challenged them to open debates.
He did, and he fiercely mobilized public opinion around it.
And his campaign worked. In 1856, the Hindu Widows Remarriage Act was officially passed.
It was a massive, massive legal victory. It was literally legalizing the forbidden.
But laws on paper are one thing, right? Actual social acceptance is a completely different beast.
Oh, totally. Vidyasagar faced severe death threats for years. He was heavily ostracized by his own community.
But he walked the talk. He actually married his own son to a widow.
That is the very definition of integrity.
It really is. Then there's the massive issue of education. The text mentions this deeply superstitious belief held by many at the time that if you educated a young girl, she would somehow become a widow.
I mean, talk about building a psychological firewall against any kind of progress.
It was purely a control mechanism. If you keep someone completely ignorant, you keep them subservient.
If you literally tell them, learning to read will kill your husband, you are weaponizing their own fear and love against them.
Reformers like Jyotiba, Phule, and the founders of the Bethune School fought tooth and nail against this specific superstition.
They understood, quite rightly, that without basic education, there is zero chance of real empowerment.
You can pass all the progressive laws you want in Calcutta or London, but if a woman sitting in a village can't read, she can't ever know her own rights.
Exactly. The text also notes a really important structural shift later on in the movement. Initially, you have to notice, it was always men reforming society for women.
Right. Men like Roy, Vidyasagar, Phule, they were the champions.
But by the 1920s, that dynamic shifts significantly. Women were finally taking the lead themselves.
Yes, you see the formation of the All India Women's Conference, the AIWC, in 1927.
You start having powerful national leaders emerge, like Sarojini Naidu, Mirabai Tata, Muthalakshmi Reddy.
This is the true maturation of the movement.
It is the crucial evolution from women being the passive objects of reform, the idea of we need to save her, to becoming the active agents of reform.
We will save ourselves.
Exactly.
Now, we really can't talk about reform in India without talking about the other massive foundational pillar of inequality, caste. Section 5 of our outline calls it a debilitating factor.
It was debilitating because it completely splintered society. It was an incredibly rigid system of total segregation.
It forcefully divided people into thousands of these small, non-interacting boxes.
And right at the very bottom, you had the untouchables, who faced horrific restrictions on their basic movement, their access to public water, their very physical presence in a village.
The text lists several broad factors that slowly help mitigate the caste system. And interestingly, a lot of them were just accidental byproducts of British rule.
It wasn't that the British were actively trying to be nice or progressive about caste.
Right. The British didn't necessarily care about ending caste at all. In fact, they often used it to categorize and control people.
But their modern infrastructure was inherently caste blind. Take the railways, for instance.
The Great Leveler.
Yeah, exactly. You simply cannot maintain strict caste segregation in a totally crowded general compartment of a steam train.
If you want to get from Bombay to Pune cheaply, you just have to sit where there's an empty space.
The train forces a high caste Brahmin to sit literally shoulder to shoulder with a Shudra. It forced a level of physical integration that strict social rules tried desperately to prevent.
You either travel and get polluted, quote unquote, or you just don't travel and you lose out on business.
And people eventually chose travel.
And the British law courts had a similar unintended effect.
Equality before the law. In a British courtroom, technically speaking, every single person was equal.
That was a radically subversive concept in a society completely governed by the Manus Redi.
Because the Manus Redi prescribed entirely different punishments for different castes for the exact same crime.
Right. Like if a Brahmin killed a man, the penalty was relatively light. But if a Shudra killed a man, the penalty was gruesome death.
The new British Penal Code just said, murder is murder. And that legally shattered the foundational basis of caste privilege, even if social prejudice remained.
But then you also had the conscious, targeted attacks by the reformers themselves. How did they actively try to dismantle the actual idea of caste? Because, as you said, you can sit next to someone on a train and still hate them.
They went straight for the theological root of the system, the law of karma.
The orthodox view basically being that if you are born low caste, it's because you did something terrible in a past life, so you essentially deserve it.
It's your divine punishment.
That is just such a powerful, insidious tool for oppression. It makes the oppressed person feel spiritually guilty for their own oppression.
It keeps them completely docile. The reformers forcefully challenged this fatalism. They argued that a person's true worth is determined by their actions in this current life, not some unprovable past one.
The Arya Samaj had a really interesting take on this, the Chaturvarna interpretation.
Yes, they argued that the original four-tier caste system in the Vedas was based purely on guna, meaning merit, and karma, meaning action, not birth.
So you aren't automatically a Brahmin just because your father was a Brahmin?
Right. You are only a Brahmin if you are highly learned, virtuous, and actively perform the duties of a teacher.
So under that theory, a cobbler's son could technically study hard and become a Brahmin.
In their theological framework, yes, absolutely. It was a very pragmatic way to keep the traditional Vedic structure, the four Varnas, but entirely remove the hereditary oppression aspect.
A clever way to modernize the system without officially rejecting the sacred Vedas.
And then crucially, you have the powerful movements rising up from the lower castes themselves. This wasn't just about upper caste people being benevolent saviors.
The lower castes were actively rising up and demanding their rights. Sri Narayana Guru down in Kerala is a prime example of this.
His impact was absolutely profound. His main slogan is legendary down there: one religion, one caste, one God for mankind.
It was a very direct rebuttal to the hyper-divisive nature of the caste system. He completely democratized spirituality. He famously consecrated a stone as an idol himself, right? I love this specific story.
Yes. The Orthodox Brahmins in the area were absolutely furious. They yelled at him, "You cannot consecrate an idol. You are not a Brahmin. This is strictly against all the scriptures."
And what did he say?
He famously turned to them and calmly replied, "This is not a Brahmin Shiva. This is an Ezava Shiva," meaning a Shiva for his own lower caste community.
That is just so incredibly witty and powerful.
It was highly subversive. He was fundamentally saying, my God is completely accessible to me. I do not need your permission or your mediation to pray.
It forcefully broke that monopoly of the priesthood we talked about right at the very beginning of the deep dive.
We also saw major direct action campaigns start to form, like the famous Vaikom Satyagraha in 1924.
That was a huge turning point. It wasn't even just about the right to enter the temple itself.
No, it was about the basic human right to simply walk on the public roads surrounding the temple.
Because the untouchables weren't even allowed on the public street if it was too close to the shrine.
That is extreme spatial segregation.
And the Satyagraha to open those roads was massive. Gandhi actually traveled down to support it. Periyar E.V. Ramasamy came all the way from Tamil Nadu to support it.
It showed clearly that the broader national movement was fully adopting the anti-caste agenda. It wasn't just about kicking the British out of India anymore. It was about securing basic dignity for all Indians.
It is truly amazing to see how all these completely different threads, women's rights, caste reform, religious rethinking, were all slowly weaving together into one fabric.
But now we have to ask the hard question.
Right, Section 6, a critical assessment. We are acting as historians here, not just cheerleaders. So looking back, did they actually succeed?
It's a mixed bag, as history almost always is. We have to maintain a balanced view. On the positive side, their contribution is just immense. They successfully liberated the individual mind from what the text calls a fear psychosis.
A fear psychosis, what does that mean in practice?
Before these movements, everyday people were utterly terrified. Terrified of crossing the ocean, the Kalapani, because it would ruin their caste. Terrified of angering a local priest. Terrified of accidentally breaking an obscure ritual.
And these movements finally said, it's okay to think for yourself. It's okay to use reason. It's okay to question authority.
That psychological liberation is huge. It's the foundation of everything that comes later.
The text also makes a point about the rise of a cultural personality, which seems really crucial.
Absolutely crucial. Think about it. You simply cannot fight for national independence if you don't actually respect yourself.
If you genuinely believe you are decadent and culturally inferior, you will just accept British rule forever as a natural fact.
These reform movements slowly gave the Indian middle class the self-respect they desperately needed.
When Swami Vivekananda went to Chicago in 1893 and spoke so eloquently about Indian spirituality, it gave Indians a massive surge of pride.
It was the feeling of, hey, we actually have something incredibly valuable to offer the world.
It totally turned the tables on the colonial narrative. The feeling was, you might have the steam engines and the machines, but we have the soul.
Exactly. It gave the Indian middle class the psychological confidence to eventually stand up and say, we actually don't need you to rule us. We are fully capable of ruling ourselves.
But and there is a big here there are significant negative aspects to these movements. We cannot ignore them.
No, we really can't. And for the exam-focused learner, this is exactly where you get your high marks, by clearly identifying the historical limitations.
So what were the major limitations?
First and foremost, the social base was incredibly narrow for a very long time. These were mostly urban, upper caste, firmly middle-class movements.
So they didn't really reach the masses.
They often totally ignored the deep rural peasantry or the urban poor in any meaningful way, at least initially. It was largely an intellectual revolution for the elite, not always a mass grassroots revolution.
That makes sense. And what about the communal aspect? The text uses the word compartmentalization.
This is truly the great tragedy of their chosen method. Remember earlier how we said they brilliantly appealed to the past to justify reform?
Yes, looking back to the ancient texts.
Well, the problem was, which past?
Ah. The Hindus naturally looked to ancient India. The Vedas, the golden age of the Guptas.
And the Indian Muslims naturally looked to the medieval period, or the history of West Asia, and the early Islamic caliphates.
So instead of building a shared, unified history to unite against the British, they were accidentally building two completely separate, parallel, glorious pasts.
Exactly. And that created a massive, growing cultural divide. It really planted the early intellectual seeds of the two-nation theory.
Because reform often meant heavily insulating your own community from the other.
Right. Like the Hindu Shuddhi movement, which aimed at reconverting people back to Hinduism, or the Islamic Wahhabi movement, which aimed at strictly purifying Islam from outside influences.
In trying to fiercely purify their own specific religions, they inadvertently built massive walls between the communities.
They heavily emphasized what made them distinct and different, rather than focusing on what made them all collectively Indian.
That is a really heavy legacy to grapple with.
It is. And the text also astutely notes that this heavy reliance on Scripture, even when used for progressive reform, sometimes severely hindered the development of a truly modern scientific temper.
How so?
Well, if your main argument for adopting modern science is always, the ancient Vedas already predicted this science centuries ago, or the Quran already hints at this scientific discovery.
You aren't really embracing the actual scientific method of inquiry.
Exactly. You're just seeking constant validation from the past. It subtly encouraged a bit of mysticism rather than pure, unadulterated rationalism. It essentially kept the modern mind firmly tied to the ancient book.
That's a really nuanced point. So bringing this all together for our final outro, what is the ultimate synthesis here?
The main synthesis is that these reform movements, despite all the structural flaws and blind spots, were the absolute intellectual backbone of Indian nationalism.
You simply can't have the political victory of 1947 without the massive social turning of the 19th century.
They took a profound national defeat and slowly, painfully transformed it into a vibrant renaissance. They took a completely broken, stagnant society and gave it the intellectual tools to repair itself.
I want to connect this directly back to the listener today. Why does all this actually matter to us right now, besides just needing to pass an exam?
It matters because the very debates they started back then, the friction between tradition versus modernity, the fight for women's rights, the core dignity of the individual, the proper role of religion in public society.
These are the exact foundations of the constitutional democracy that India is today.
When you read the Indian preamble today, liberty, equality, fraternity, you are directly hearing the historical echoes of Rammohan Roy, Vidyasagar, and Phule. They aggressively started the conversation that we are all still having today.
That is a really powerful connection to make. Now, before we officially wrap up, I want to leave the listener with a very provocative thought directly from the text. It mentions the conservative brand of liberalism after the year 1857.
Oh, this is a fascinating historical what-if. After the massive revolt of 1857, the British government got really scared.
Because they realized that their direct interference in Indian social customs, like legally banning Sati or officially allowing widow remarriage, had deeply angered the orthodox elements and helped trigger the massive mutiny.
So they completely backed off.
They adopted a strict policy of non-interference.
They essentially said, look, we will build the trains, and we will definitely collect the taxes, but we absolutely will not touch your gods or your women ever again. They officially withdrew from leading any social reform.
They just washed their hands of the whole thing.
They did. And here is the truly provocative thought. Did that sudden British withdrawal actually force Indians to take full ownership of their own modernization?
Since the colonial government flat out refused to do it anymore, the Indian nationalists simply had to do it themselves.
It made social reform an absolutely inseparable part of the broader freedom struggle. You couldn't just casually ask the British to pass a progressive law anymore. You had to go out and change your own society from the ground up.
That is really something to mull over. The British stepping back forced the Indians to finally step up.
Exactly. It ironically made the modernization movement truly Indian.
Well, that brings us to the very end of this massive deep dive. We have covered an incredible amount of ground today, from the smoky banks of the Phule River all the way to the organizing halls of the AIWC.
From the cold logic of rationalism to the absolute fire of the Vaikom Satyagraha, it's been quite a journey.
A huge thank you to everyone for sticking with us through all of this. This is dense, heavy material, but it is exactly the stuff that builds a truly strong foundational understanding of history.
A quick reminder, go out and download those free notes and PYQs from the public Telegram channel right now.
They are sitting there waiting to help you properly consolidate everything we just spent the last hour talking about. Don't let all this info just evaporate from your brain. Lock it in with those practice notes.
And if you want the ultimate premium experience, the model answers for mains, the highly organized notes, the full video library access, join the private library today.
Just shoot us a quick DM on the public Telegram channel. It is honestly the best investment you can make for your preparation.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep connecting the historical dots.
Please like, share, and subscribe to Simplified UPSC by PPP. Your support really means the world to us and keeps the lights on. Let us know in the comments what specific topic you want us to dive into next, and we will catch you in the next deep dive.